schools like to bask in the glory of good publicity, but how does a school cope when disaster strikes? The London Academy in Edgware faced just such a crisis when a pupil was stabbed and killed outside its gates in 2006. Kyan Prince was 15 and a talented footballer. He was a member of the Queen's Park Rangers youth team. The circumstances of his death became a huge national news story, and the London Academy was at the centre of a media frenzy.
I knew there was a disturbance, an incident outside of school. Senior staff had told me that. So I made a conscious decision to stay away and sit in my office and get the information coming in, as with a couple of other senior members of staff. Once we realised that he'd been killed and that he was dead and that had been confirmed, within 5 minutes of that we had phone calls from the media. Crises are easy to deal with, okay? That's a key thing to remember all the time. In the middle of a crisis, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. The difference between that and other situations you've been in is this is very, very intense, and it is immensely overwhelming. You don't notice that until you kind of stop to think about it. And I think it was when I got home that evening that I suddenly thought, A, what I'd been through, and B, what we were going to expect the following day.
And the next day, the media interest intensified, extending beyond the principal and the school to the pupils themselves.
Kind of expected the fact that I would get hassle. I expected the fact that we as a school community would get hassle. But what I didn't expect is that journalists could walk up to children, follow them home, secure their phone numbers, offer them money for photographs, ask for stories, look for someone to blame effectively, rather than just simply dealing with the incident that happened. That's the bit that shocked me most.
The London Academy is ready to reflect on its media experience. We've brought along public relations expert Mark Leach to meet with the principal, Phil Hearn, to review the lessons learned from the crisis.
The decision that I made, having spoke to my chair of governors and informed him of the situation, having spoke to the local authority and informed them of the situation, the decision then was that we had to talk to somebody to get some information out, to get these people, in a sense, away from us, and to give them something to kind of use. So I spoke to the Press Association, gave them an interview over the phone, which they then put out on the wires, and our phones then went quiet for a while, and we were able to kind of go home.
You always stick to the facts, so you keep very, very straightforward. You don't digress from those. You don't say anything that you can't stand up. You ensure that all of your information is entirely factual. And don't be afraid to keep it boring.
The following morning, there was much more interest then from the visual media and from radio. So I made a decision then that we needed to do a to-camera piece, which did two things. One, it dealt with the immediacy, but it gave them enough information to be able to use it for the next couple of days, which kind of meant that people again would stay away from us for a period of time. We had some contact with the local authority press office, and the advice they gave us was very, very useful, and the support they gave us was very useful.
I think it's absolutely right to do the Press Association, as you say. It's very difficult if you give one interview to one outlet to then refuse another outlet.
Yeah.
But when Phil Hearn did his first television interview, he decided to move beyond the facts of Kyan Prince's death to criticise the government's stance on knife crime.
One of the issues we wanted to get across was that, what happened to Kyan is part of a national picture. And if we just focus on this one and don't kind of focus on what else is happening, then we're actually doing everybody a disservice. And that was the kind of message that I wanted to get across, and that we as a school wanted to get across.
I mean, it's an interesting thing to do, and it's quite a risky thing to do, I think, when you're in a crisis situation. And the danger is obviously that it opens a bit of a Pandora's box. Did you find that that's what happened, that there was a great deal of interest following those remarks?
It came in two phases, in a sense. There's in one sense, it wouldn't have mattered what we'd said. They were interested in finding out about Kyan and what had happened. The notion of kind of widening this was partly to deflect some of that, but also to put this in a context, because we had to kind of preserve our integrity as an organisation as well, because these things are rare events that happen, and we have to, as an organisation, go on beyond that, and the community has to survive beyond that.
Ultimately, a lot of crisis management is about being dull. If you look at the people who do it well and who do it often, such as the spokespeople that are on TV for the police, the sort of messages they put out are very calm, very reassuring, but not very interesting, because they don't want to take the story off in any new direction. If you do decide that you want to go off of that and make any sort of point, you have to be very, very clear that that can have some ramifications for you and you will need to handle them.
Phil Hearn believes his decision to speak out about knife crime was the right one, ultimately producing positive results.
I think there are two positive things that came out of it. One is what went into the new education bill, which talks about schools having permission to search youngsters. I think that's a really, really important thing. I don't think many schools would want to do it. I don't think that many schools need to do it. But now we will have the right to do that. And I had a phrase in my head which was quite controversial, which was, which is the more dangerous, a turkey twizzler or a knife? Because we were obsessed at that time with healthy eating, and probably quite rightly so. But there didn't seem to be the same level of action or interest in knives.
Dealing with this crisis led Phil Hearn to dramatically increase meetings with staff and pupils to keep them up to date with events.
It was a question then of sit down with senior staff, explain to them the situation that we had, talk through the issues we had to deal with. And that was from simple things like making sure all the blinds were down at the end of the school, so prying cameras couldn't see in and take unfortunate shots of staff and children, right the way through to how we were actually going to seriously deal with the fact that we still had these media organisations all camped outside wanting to talk to us.
Beyond the sort of response to the media, which obviously the media were, as they do, pretty demanding. Was there an effort, I'm sure there was at the time, to communicate through the school?
I mean, we had daily meetings with the staff, daily meetings with groups of children. So we did a lot of primary school things like circle time and so on with the youngsters to get them to share things with us and share ideas about how to move this forward. One of the most important things was about reassuring the families and the parents, both of the youngsters that were currently with us and of the youngsters that were signed up to join us in the following September, both as sixth form students and as incoming year sevens. And strangely enough, in the September, the 210 kids that were signed up to join us, 210 kids joined us.
There's a big reassurance job to be done, as you say. I mean, in an ideal world, you would be able to inform all of these people before the media does.
Yes.
In reality, that never happened.
Unlike in this shocking case, which couldn't be predicted, some potentially negative news stories are known about in advance. Are there some general rules about handling this sort of bad news?
There are other news stories which you have more of a lead in time. You know there are going to be bad exam results coming out or a negative Ofsted report. You know that there's been an incident at the school that's you've had to call the police in, for example.
Using genuine newspaper headlines faced by other schools, Phil discusses with Mark how he might handle this type of bad news story.
This certainly is one you can't ignore.
No.
The question is how long has this been going on, and where is the story coming from? He's clearly been running for a while if he's been tried, found guilty, and he's now been jailed. So one would have had a whole kind of series of experiences of dealing with the media to get yourself to this particular point. In terms of dealing with this, it is really a question then of reassuring the world that this individual's actions are not the actions of everybody else in the school. That the youngsters involved with this are having the support that's necessary to get them through this particular situation, and that we try and carry on as best we can with educating the rest of the youngsters that are here in the school.
I think you also, you need to preempt the questions that will be asked and get a fairly detailed timeline of exactly what happened when and how much the school knew and when they acted and exactly what they did. And also to ensure that there's a lot of direct communication going on with parents. I mean, this is not something that you want communicated solely through the newspapers. This is a very good example of the difference between your media and your audience, because the media will take a line, and they will take a line based on the conflict, because that's where the story is. So they lead with the draconian head. Now actually, your audience is your parents, the potential parents who may be thinking of sending their children to your school, and they might like this. They might think this is a very worthy stand that the school's taking.
We asked the actual head teacher behind this headline what she thought about it.
In my last school where I was head, it was a small rural school, and we brought in a food policy, and part of that food policy was a snack policy for break times. And I decided that we would limit the choices the children would make. That went down with most of the parents really well, and the children, but some parents disagreed, and they took it to the local press. And the headline was "Draconian Head Bans Junk Food." Well, of course, that message wasn't the best of headlines for a small school to have. And yet, when you looked at it again, you know, banning of junk food was what the policy was all about. So I think because of the positive relationship that we had with the press, it was able to be sort of slightly turned, though give the parents' message as well.
But how does a school's relationship with the media move on once a crisis has passed?
Do you have a particularly proactive stance towards the media, towards getting positive news stories out?
No, we hadn't, and in one sense that's a product of the situation we've been in when I came here in 1997, that there was a lot of negative stories about this school in 1997, 8, right up until the early 2000s, and I hadn't positively gone out of my way to run stories about things that we've been doing.
When a negative story breaks, one of the things it highlights is that very quickly that becomes everything that anybody knows about that school. And particularly now, stories hang around, so anybody Googling a school 5-6 years down the line will get those stories back. It's very easy to batten down the hatches and think, right, that's it, I'm now not going to deal with the press, they've been unfair or they've been particularly vindictive around a certain issue. They're ultimately doing their job and they will continue to do that, and if a bad news story happens they'll do it again. But the important thing from a school, as with any organisation, is to make sure there's a good flow of positive stories.
A full checklist of what to do when bad news strikes is available on the Teachers TV website and can be found on the programme's resource page. Having
gone through this set of experiences, I think it would be useful if we did that and we had that bank of stories, and that we publish our newsletter, for instance, on our website. It would be useful if we simply emailed that to the local paper, so at least then they've got some copy that they could use and pick up with pictures they could pick up and use.
So following the experiences that you've had here, if you had 3 tips to give people on how they deal with a similar sort of crisis, what would they be?
The first thing I think is stay calm and not feel the need to simply react. The second one I think is get some good advice from wherever you can acquire it from. And we were very lucky that we had good advice from the local authorities' press office. And the third one I think is not to react to all the, or not to respond to all the requests for information, but to use an organisation to do that for you. In our case, we use the Press Association. There are lots of others out there, and give them the copy so that they can distribute it. That then gives you some breathing space.
No, I think I agree with all of those. I mean, I'd add, don't be afraid to be dull. But I think if you ever step outside of that comfort zone, it needs to be something that you choose to do deliberately, rather than something you're forced into because the media pushes you for it.